Hey, I'm Damon. Welcome to An Asset Worth 1,000 Words, Building Dynamic and Reusable Content. Since you are now... Are the doors locked yet? It's important for this bit. So close. Since you are now my captive audience, I'm going to do my big reveal early. This is primarily a narrative talk, but it's very relevant to content design, I promise. All right, so let's break down that title. What is this talk? Right here we have fun and exciting approaches to content and story design. Approaches that are actually like pretty cheap to use. Your producer might not hate you. And if you use them properly, you can get a lot of replay value on the cheap. But enough of these lofty and unattainable promises. I mean, like, that shit about producers? Who am I anyway? So I'm Damon and I'm a narrative designer. That means I work at the weird intersection of game design and traditional game writing. Here's a handy visual aid. But basically my job boils down to finding new and interesting ways to tell stories through gameplay. I've been doing this since 2012 and I've worked on a pretty wide variety of games across a bunch of different genres. I've also worked on things like narrative design tools, narrative scripting languages, and things which make internet Nazis angry. One thing I haven't done before is do a talk on something I'm good at, so please excuse me if I need to drink a lot of water. So, you have a problem. Maybe it's a hypothetical problem. Those are the best kinds. You're looking into making your next game, but you're trying to figure out how you get like the best value out of your game design. Perhaps you're looking to prioritize any of the following things. One, I want to make a game where I can introduce new content post-release without it being ridiculously expensive. I want to increase replay value. Make a game where players can keep finding new things and new ways to experience the game. 3, I want to make a game that respects and responds to the decisions that my players make in a meaningful way. And 4, I want to build content that I can recycle and reuse in interesting and cheap ways. There's something really good for that. It's going to solve all your problems. You might have heard for it. Super cheap, very easy. No one's ever had issues with this. Respect yourself, please. Let me show you something better. Modular design. This is a modular narrative talk. I'm going to teach you about modular design because it's excellent, and we'll also touch on a fairly new approach to narrative in open-ended games. So what is modular design actually good for? First, it's particularly good for making narrative games, but the concepts are broadly applicable across genres. You can apply these concepts to RPGs, narrative games, mobile games, living games, and games as a service really benefit from this. And it's not just useful for narrative games. Even if your game isn't explicitly a narrative game, designing it along modular principles can spawn emergent stories through interesting interactions and keep players coming back. And finally, it can be applied to your game design at like varying levels. You don't have to go fully modular. You can just have like one small part of it that's modular. Like a good example is Borderlands. Like their weapon system is a bit modular, a bit procedural, but like that's not the entire game, and it worked out very well for them. What is it though? I like to describe it as content that you can approach from any direction. That's oversimplifying, but everything is basically an extension of that. Modular content allows you to pay a lot of attention to the choices the player has made and to the general world state of the game. So here we've got a piece of modular content. It's made of little bits of content called storylets. Our game is full of dozens of these, many of which you can play in any order and are essentially interchangeable. We've got a bunch of player choices and variables that we can refer to. This storylet is built to take these specific things into consideration, and this little bit of story will branch in meaningful ways to reflect not just the player choice, but the world state. And again, your game might have dozens of storylets if it's a really small one, or hundreds, or thousands if you work at fail better games. They can be big pieces of content or just tiny ones that are just a couple lines of dialogue. Modular design, and like that's the great thing about modular design. It is fundamentally scalable and extensible. So let's take a look at a real example of this. This is Sunless Sea by Fail Better Games, who I just mentioned. Most of their storytelling follows a set of values called quality-based narrative, which gradually assigns players a big like inventory of qualities and shows or hides parts of the story based off of that. It's heavily modular. It's got layers of modularity. So you've got locations, which are essentially interchangeable. Each one is home to a family of unique stories which are themselves heavily responsive to both player actions and the world state in general. The setting of the story, and this is an important bit, is really carefully designed to complement the game's design. In a nutshell, it takes place like in an underground sea beneath Victorian-era London. The large portion of the city has just fallen into. And it's very creepy and eldritch and Lovecraftian. And a large part of the game's overall concept rests upon the idea that the sea isn't the same time every time you visit it. In fact, the best way to explain the way that they generate the world is through the idea of shuffling a deck of cards. You might have a deck of 30 locations, but every new game is only going to give you 10 on the world map. And even if you come across the same location in a different spot on a subsequent playthrough, it's going to mean something different because it's going to be different distance from the main port. It's going to have different relationships with the content around it, and your player is going to be in a different state when they encounter it. And with every new platform, they've been able to ship new content. There's lots of DLC. They've got a sequel that's just come out, Sunless Skies. I recommend it. It's quite good. And another great example is 80 Days, which is based off of the novel by Jules Verne. It's almost entirely modular, and it uses its setting to its advantage. So each location in the game is made of storylets, maybe 5, maybe like 30, depending on if it's like a major location. And each storylet presents a different piece of content based on the player's previous actions and on the places they visited. For their prototype, they just had to make a string of locations that took them around the world. That's all they had to do. And everything after that was just adding to the possible set of paths through the game. And once you have enough storylets and enough modules, you end up having a pretty ridiculously large number of paths through which you can navigate the game map. And each playthrough is essentially, after that, a unique story. In the development of 80 Days, Incool went from 20 cities in an early prototype to, I believe, 150 distinct locations with 371 distinct journeys upon release. And then with every platform release, they added more content and more storylines, which were seamlessly integrated into the existing content. And I'm not going to say it wouldn't have been possible without modular design, but it would have been incredibly frustrating without modular design. This is what the game looks like internally. This is written in a language called Ink. You can see how this script sort of seamlessly integrates mentions of places that they've maybe visited and adapts the script based on that. And also takes into account whether they've decided to stay overnight in a hotel before exploring Beijing in this case. So third case study, this is in my notes to say this is a short one, but it's like the longest one. We've looked at a couple like modularly designed games where the experience is fairly carefully curated and tailored. Here's one where part of the charm is that the systems interact in really interesting, unexpected ways, and that's like half the charm of the game. So the key design point with Caves of Cud is that they use procedural generation, but with a really strong setting. Every system is designed to complement the setting, not to just exist for the sake of having a procedural system. And they're designed to cause fun and interesting interactions. So the game has a faction system where almost everything, all animals, some inanimate objects like doors and bees' nests? No, flowers. Flowers have factions. And each faction has a different disposition towards like a number of other factions. So when you interact with anything in a faction, whether that's fighting them or sharing water with them, you're going to affect your standing with the other factions that they have relationships with. Or sometimes those interfaction relationships will change without your involvement. Because the game has spawned two animals of different factions next to each other, and they're going to murder each other, and that faction relationship is going to get worse. So the player doesn't need to be an ingredient in that interaction, and that's fascinating. And so this sort of systems-driven narrative is called, I call it systemic narrative, and I'd say that Caves of Cud is like one of the only games right now that really nails systemic narrative right now. It all comes down to like designing with intent and with like a rough idea of what you'd like these systems to produce, and then getting surprised with what it gives you and then running with that. So, the case studies range from being very linear games like 80 Days, with a sort of defined and immutable start and end point, to totally open-ended games like Caves of Cud that only end when you die. Anything on this spectrum is totally valid and a fine use case for modular design. You can totally have, for example, a traditional RPG with modular storytelling and a faction system and the interesting interactions that come out of that. It just requires a different approach to making an entirely linear game. How would you structure that sort of thing, though? How do you build modularity into a game with a carefully authored and linear storyline? The answer is you don't. If you've decided to make a linear RPG with fully authored and linear content, modular design isn't for you. You've already got the game in your head. Like that's fine. I highly recommend, if you want to use modular design, start thinking about that before you start designing the game, or at least very soon after you start designing the game, because it can be kind of a pain to reconcile like the slight loss of authorial voice that you get with modular design. But there's a middle ground. So one approach is to sort of lay out your story beats and have decisions made by the player during like modular side missions affect things about those big story beats. Additionally, you can allow players to approach these side missions in any order, but reference their choices in other side missions, have those be heavily modular and reactive to player actions. So as long as these side missions are their own discrete, interchangeable, standalone pieces of content, that still works as modular design. So now we're going to go through the process of building a piece of modular content. First, I'm going to go through tools you can use, and then we'll build a storylet together. First, languages. So this is assuming that you want to build a game that's more than just simple text. Text games are fine, I love them. But if that's what you want to do, use Twine. Twine's fine. But if you want to work with a game engine, Twine is not really fine for that. So these are my two main recommendations. Full disclosure, I have worked on Yarn, on documentation, authoring tools, and the language itself, but I think both options are great. I'm not going to go through all the points individually, but basically this boils down to how complex you like your tools and how experienced you are with game writing. Also, I would be amiss if I didn't mention the tool I worked on at Starfire. It's specifically designed for making modular content, and I think it's pretty good. So, here's the 4 main components of a storylet. At their core, they're very, very simple. You have prerequisites, a piece of content, a choice, and an outcome. The exciting bit happens when you start to chain them together and when they start colliding off of each other. If you're having trouble what this looks like, figuring out what this looks like, Reigns is a fantastic example of a game almost entirely composed of storylets. I think it's one of the most effective demonstrations of how potent they can be as a building block of your narrative. So let's do some game design fan fiction. So before we do anything else, let's look at the prerequisites. Let's say that this can only be unlocked if you've done the unthinkable and mingled with commoners. Disgusting. So next, what's going to happen? What if someone threatens to blackmail you over this horrible, disgusting, unsanitary thing you've done? Now, following the Reign style, you just have 2 choices. You can call the guards, or you can ask the blackmailer what they want. And depending on which choice you select, you get a variable change and a flag is set so that we can refer to this choice later if we want. Maybe that comes in the form of a doctor claiming you've picked up some terrible illness from those unsanitary commoners, or in the form of the king grounding you for a weekend. But once we write a few dozen of these, we've got a pretty interesting set of situations to navigate. Once we write a few hundred of these, we've got a video game. And it's also worth mentioning that Reigns uses a shuffled deck system, like I mentioned before, but it's obviously far more literal in this case. It adds and removes cards based on what's relevant, the choices you've made. So you will end up seeing the same sort of base events a lot of times, but they'll often appear in different contexts. So you might have to make the opposite choice that you made last time, just to balance your numbers, and that means they serve a purpose instead of just being repetitive filler. Regardless of whether your game is made of storylets, it's definitely possible to spend way too much time and way too much money making a lot of storylets. If you decide to have a custom 3D animation attached to each storylet, your producer isn't going to like it. If you want a nice big piece of custom art on each storylet, that's a terrible idea and your producer isn't going to like it. So before you decide to make a game using modular design, again, I highly recommend having a really big think about whether it works for what you want to make, making a prototype, and then seeing whether that's something you can make that can scale cheaply. Modular design isn't automatically cheap. Nothing is automatically cheap. But I do think it's very much an approach that's worth considering, especially if you have a game that you would like to have ongoing support for, like a live game, because your game could go from this to this to this. And I think that's beautiful. In conclusion, modular narrative is like a ball pit. Thank you. I will not be taking questions. If you're interested in learning more about this, I highly recommend taking a look at the games I mentioned today, as well as basically everything Emily Short's ever written, because she is a genius about all forms of interactive storytelling. Particularly, I also really like procedural generation in game design. It's a fantastic book by a bunch of highly experienced game designers who basically only work in procedural generation. So you've got people like Tan Adams, the Case of Cud team, and they have some really fantastic insights. And that's all. This was a short talk. So am I good to take questions? Awesome. Any questions?
What are your thoughts on something like Betrayal and House of the Hill?
I haven't played it. Tell me about it.
It's we explore a haunted mansion, like Cabin in the Woods style, where you explore rooms and different events occur depending on the rooms you're in.
Mm.
Like decks determine what you draw and what happens. And at one point, one player is revealed to be the traitor, depending on what happened that turn. And at this point, I think around 100 different scenarios happen, and that changes the game in some way. And that uses a lot of well, the tiles of each room of the house are, there is a massive stack of them, so each one, you'll come across each one a bunch of different times, but the situation you engage with it is different. So say you enter the chapel and gain 1 strength. That could either be boosting up a strong stack of what you've got, or bringing you back from the brink of death. And I feel like that is both a really good example of a case study of procedural design in modular content in a non-video game setting, but still very easily applicable.
Yeah, a great term that the Caves of Cud devs use for this is a combinatorial explosion. And then, yeah, I think games still have a lot to learn from tabletop, particularly games like that, and even more like open-ended stuff. Yeah, I think that is A+. Who are you?
How do you, when you've got like a whole bunch of storylets, how do you go about like balancing stuff for the player? Like how do you go about checking for balance when you've got like a million different things?
The way that Reigns does it is they track 4 variables. I think it's your treasury, your relationship with the church, the people, and the military. And that's like a really simple way of keeping you in check, because if any of them hits maximum or minimum, game over.
But like how do you, when you're designing the game, how do you balance it so that like a player doesn't just get like unfairly hit with a whole bunch of really cool stuff and just dies from it?
Right, yeah. So that is basically the theory on this is they use like salience-based narrative. So you're looking at what the player's doing right now, and you build a system to find the most relevant storylets to present to them. That can be in an RPG like their level, like whether they're a mage or a wizard or whatever. There's plenty of ways to solve that.
Sorry, what was the name of, not yarn or ink, but the third one, the next slide that you got?
It's called GCAP.
Jacquard.
I'll tweet out the links. Yeah, it's still like in alpha, but it's good.
Yeah, how much overhead is involved in kind of pulling those things like in yarn and the third one, which...
GCAP, that's an authoring tool, so you don't have to like roll that into your engine.
Okay, so for the other two then, how much work is involved in rolling that into a Unity game?
Okay, so both of those languages export to JSON, which is trivial to parse. Also, Yarn has a parser called Yarn Spinner, which is pretty simple to roll into Unity because it's like made for Unity. Also, it's got great documentation, which I wrote. But yeah, Yarn Spinner is pretty simple, and there's also a narrative games Slack which Secret Lab runs. They're the ones who started the Yarn Spinner project. And so you can hop into that Slack and just sort of ask any questions, and they're very friendly. Is that all?
Hey, when you're like putting this stuff together before implementing it, what are your like best practices for like keeping all of this stuff organized and well presented, so you can make sure that it is all working the way that you want it to work and fitting together the way you want it to fit together?
I would recommend not putting all of your storylets in one big bucket. Yeah, like honestly, I would still tend to I wouldn't tackle like a super open-ended game at this point. I would definitely silo off my buckets of storylets in some way, whether that's through area, through character. Yeah, you're going to end up with a lot of text files, and there's not really like a one-size-fits-all solution for that. All right, I think we're done. All right, thank you for turning up.